Stan Kenton Orchestra from 1955 gets us going in this Sunday edition of Crosswinds. With our jazz theme, it is something called the Intermission Riff. You're listening to Crosswinds, brought to you every Sunday live, courtesy of our great friends at the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. We are live and on the radio until 2 p.m. Eastern Time, or as close to 2 p.m. as we can get, bringing you some great jazz to put that groove in your lazy Sunday step. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you are all doing well. Stick around for the next 3 hours. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's play some jazz. First hour of this program is always big band music. Today we'll get started by taking the A train. This is Duke Ellington. first set of the big band session, we go with 4. Going back to the mid-60s, the Count Basie Orchestra, wrapping things up with something called Corner Pocket. Before that, we did the brothers Dorsey, first Jimmy Dorsey and his orchestra, doing a piece called Sunset Strip. And not to be outdone, his brother Tommy was in there as well with his orchestra, doing something called Opus number 1. And we started by taking the A train, always a most reliable and swinging train. Duke Ellington and his orchestra with Take the A Train, his theme song for a long, long time. Thank you for tuning in on this Sunday. It's a beautiful day where I am. I hope it is a beautiful day where you are. We are here till about 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Grab your friends. Let them know what you do on brunch every Sunday. Get them turned on and tuned into some great jazz. Brought to you courtesy of Crosswinds. Les and Larry Elgart start out this particular set.
Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowin' reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. They made him blow a bugle for his Uncle Sam. It really brought him down because he couldn't jam. The captain seemed to understand, because the next day the cap went out and drafted a band. And now the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. A toot, a toot, a tooty-lad, a tooty blows it eight to the bar. In boogie rhythm, he can't blow a note unless the bass and guitar is playing with him. He makes a company jump when he plays reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. He was a boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. And when he plays boogie woogie bugle, he was busy as a bzzz bee. And when he plays, he makes the company jump eight to the bar. He's a boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. Do 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 da da do da da do do. He blows it eight to the bar. He can't blow a note if the bass and guitar isn't with him. And the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's a boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. To sleep with Boogie every night and wakes them up the same way in the early bright. They clap their hands and stamp their feet because they know how he plays. When someone gives him a beat, he really breaks it up. When he plays reveille, he's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. Company jumps when he plays reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Me, I've just found something to see. Oh, it's a pig that does the boogie, yes sirree, and he really gets to do it solidly.
You mean he really gets to do it solidly? This little piggy went to market, this little piggy stayed home.
But this little piggy was a boogly woogly piggy, and he boogie woogied all the way home.
This little piggy had roast beef, this little piggy had none.
But this little piggy was a boogly woogly piggy, and he did the lindy all the way home.
Oink, oink,
piggly wiggy piggy,
oink, oink,
boogly woogie boogie,
oink, 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 oink. The boogly woogly piggly with the oink, oink. This little piggy dug too big. This piggy thought the waltz was divine.
But this little piggy was a hip little piggy, and he
boogie woogied all of the time. Dug to be gone.
This piggy thought the waltz divine.
But this little piggy was a hip little piggy, and he boogie woogied all of the time.
This little piggy was a hip little piggy, and he boogie woogied all of the time.
did 4 in that set. Little Boogie in your Sunday step. Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra wrapping things up, doing Clarence Pinetop Smith's Boogie Woogie, written back in the 20s. One of the original Boogie Woogie compositions. Before that, Glenn Miller and his orchestra, Tex Beneke on the lead vocals with the Modern Airs. The Boogie Wooglie Piggy, Tex Beneke, tenor saxophone player and vocalist with the Glenn Miller Band. He took over the band after the disappearance of Glenn Miller during World War II. Before that, we had the Andrews Sisters, their biggest hit, I believe, covered by Bette Midler in the 1980s, the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. And we started off with Les and Larry Elgart, Taking You Down to That Philadelphia Way. That piece was used a long time as the theme song of Dick Clark's American Bandstand. It was the American Bandstand Boogie. Barry Manilow did a version of that song in the 1970s that Dick used going onwards as his theme. All this great swing music, and you learn things. Bet you didn't expect that. Thank you again for tuning in. We're here till 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The Boogie continues. Brian Setzer and his orchestra with The Dirty Boogie.
Clean, it's real low down and it's kinda mean. The dirty boogie, the dirty boogie. Oh, when I get low down, it's the dirty boogie for me. Ow. The dirty boogie. What's it called? The dirty boogie. Hey yo. The dirty boogie. Well, how's it go? The dirty boogie. Not too slow when I get low down. It's the dirty boogie for me. It's the dirty boogie for me. What's it called? Hey, whoa. How's it go? I'm not too slow when I get low down. It's the dirty boogie for me.
little tune we gonna play for you. Ain't nothing to it and it's easy to do. Call the Calloway Boogie. The Calloway Boogie. It keeps you grooving 24 hours a day. If you like music with the boogie beat, here's a little ditty that's so really alright. It's the Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. It keeps you grooving 24 hours a day. I woke up with the blues the other day. The cats started swinging and they blew them away with the Calloway Boogie. The Calloway Boogie. It keeps you grooving 24 hours a day. We play waltzes, bebop and jive. This is the kind of music gonna keep you alive. It's the Calloway Boogie. The Calloway Boogie. It keeps you grooving 24 hours a day. Yeah. Boogie with some hidey ho. Listen up, Jack, here's the way it goes. Hidey, 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 hidey. Hody, 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 ho. It keeps you grooving 24 hours a day. Yeah.
We boogie through another set with 3 songs, wrapping it up with Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, doing a little something called the Calloway Boogie, their little salute and tip of the hat to Cab Calloway, complete with the Heidi Heidi Highs. Before that, out of the Southwest, Colin James' Little Big Band, doing the Boogie Twist. And we started off with Brian Setzer and his orchestra doing the Dirty Boogie. First hour of Crosswinds, as a gentle reminder, is always big band music. Come back next week. We'll do this all over again in the first hour. And we're going to get you to the top of the hour. 2 songs in this set to get you straight up at the top of the hour. We begin with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, straight out of the Village Vanguard nightclub in New York City. This is called Kids Are Pretty People. How do I say blues? We wrap up the big band session with two songs in that set, Bob Mintzer and his orchestra. Doing a piece called Original People, Bob Mintzer, longtime saxophone player with the jazz fusion group known as the Yellow Jackets. Bob Mintzer also a big supporter based on his composing, arranging, and directing of big bands all over the world. He is the director of the WDR Big Band out of Cologne, Germany. Has a piece called Original People. That goes out to the almost 7 million original people that were out and about yesterday, spending Saturday in parks all over America. Some of the signs and some of the costumes in the No Kings protest were quite freaking creative. Before that, the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra out of New York City, originally formed by Thad Jones and Mel Lewis way back in the 70s. And that was a piece from them called Kids Are Pretty People. If you look at your clocks, your timepieces, your computers, your other devices, you will see that it is straight up the top of the hour, straight up high noon on the east coast of the United States. You're listening to The House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. We are live and worldwide this morning in Crosswinds, bringing you some great jazz to put that groove in your lazy Sunday. Hour number one is the big band session. It is over and in the books. We continue by playing some more jazz for the next 2 hours or so. A real cross-section of things in the next 2 hours. We start with some horn bands, going back to about 1975 or so. This is a band out of Chicago, Illinois, called Chicago. The album is Chicago 5, and this is a hit by Varese.
to go, no, no.
The second hour and beyond of Crosswinds begins with 3 in that set from an album called Blood, Sweat, and Tears 4, right around 1974 or so. David Clayton Thomas on the vocals. Great horn work on that track. Song's called Go Down Gamblin'. Before that, from 2010, a band from New York City by way of New Orleans. Band is known as Afroskull. The album from which the song came was called To Obscurity and Beyond. Come on, Mr. DJ, get it right. The song that you heard was called Me and My TV. And we started with Chicago, early 1970s. The album was called Chicago 5. And the song that you heard was called A Hit by Varese. You're listening to Crosswinds. We're here till about 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Plenty of time for you to grab your friends. Let them know how you spend your Sunday brunch. And see if you can't get your friends involved as well. Going back to the middle 1940s. Some Charlie Parker. This is The Bird. Three songs in that set, a couple of them feature the guitar work of the great Django Reinhart. We wrap it up with the great Django and the Coleman Hawkins band, Coleman Hawkins, tenor saxophone player on the track that you heard called Crazy Rhythm. Before that, the Hot Club of France. They existed in Paris in the middle part of the 1930s. Django Reinhart on guitar, Stepan Grappelli on violin. Just an amazing band. Check out their recordings. The song that you heard was called Hot Lips. And we began 1947. Charlie Parker Quartet. Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Max Roach on drums. Piece called The Bird. You're listening to Crosswinds. We are about halfway through this episode of Crosswinds, and we do so. Art Tatum on jazz piano on that track. Song is entitled Indiana, but I think if you listened, back home again in Indiana. We're here till about 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining me on this ride through the history of jazz. And it is the history of jazz that we're featuring today. We're going to go to the cool school for this particular set of music. We're now talking early to middle 1950s. And we begin with the Jerry Mulligan Quartet. This is something called Five Brothers.
it's a time for walking, no time for talking. Grab the walking shoes that hang in the closet and go out for a walk in the air. Breathe it all in and be glad to be there. Smell the greenness, out goes the meanness. Get your walking shoes and let them deposit you in skies free of trouble and care. Hey, look around, see the sun everywhere. Just fly. When you feel that you're starting to cry, just get out and get under that sky all blue, and you will find it's true. You're able to do anything that you ever could want to do. So don't be gloomy, just listen to me. Bask in the glow of days that know no blues. You just can't lose if you'll only use your walking shoes. Repeating, you have been cheating, and your cheating's giving me restless feet. And then he gave me the unhappy news. Baby was putting on his walking shoes. His detection needed correction. Told him no one else had won my affection, but my troubles are coming in twos. My walking papers and his walking shoes burn. How I burned when I learned I was spun, and the tables would turn with a situation. His imagination started to climb, working overtime. Now he's gone and I'm alone, me and my telephone. I'm hoping he will change his views. I've got the blues on account of his walking shoes.
Four in that set, featuring the baritone saxophone of Jerry Mulligan. Jerry Mulligan on that last track, along with Dave Brubeck on piano. It's from a Dave Brubeck album that was released in the latter part of the 1980s. A duet called Jerry Go Round, written specifically for Mr. Mulligan by Mr. Brubeck. A little bit of a classical influence on that track in the form of a fugue. Before that, Cleo Lane, out of England, great jazz vocalist who passed away earlier this year. She did the vocals, Jerry Mulligan did the baritone saxophone on a piece called Walking Shoes. Chet Baker was in there as well, Chet doing a trumpet on a song that he recorded in the mid-1950s called September Song. Chet Baker, one of the leading trumpet players, along with Miles Davis, during the 1950s and what became known as the Cool School. A little bit more laid back, a little bit more relaxed style of jazz. Chet also a very fine singer. The piece that you heard him play was a jazz standard called September Song. And we started off with the Jerry Mulligan Quartet from the early 1950s. Chet Baker on trumpet, Jerry Mulligan on baritone saxophone. The song that you heard was called Five Brothers, Jerry Mulligan's quartet. Very, very groundbreaking at that time, early 1950s. It was saxophone, trumpet, bass and drums. No corded instrument, no piano, and no guitar. Very unusual for the early 1950s. Hope you enjoyed that set. We get you a little bit closer to the top of the hour with something from Keith Jarrett. Couple of legends on that particular track. The late Charlie Hayden on bass and Keith Jarrett on piano. It's a song called Dance of the Infidels. That's a Bud Powell composition. That's a very fine duet album that they did, gosh, maybe now 20 years ago. Just really, really cool stuff. A lot of cool jazz music that just kind of sits under the radar. because unless you tune into a jazz station, you don't hear jazz music on too many other radio stations anymore, but you hear it here 3 hours every week. It is Crosswinds, and this is Brian Blade and the Fellowship Band. We are into the third hour of Crosswinds on this late October Sunday. From a 2020 album entitled Long Gone. That is also the title of the track that you just heard. Joshua Redman on tenor saxophone, Brad Meldow on piano, Christian McBride on bass, Brian Blade on drums. Kind of a super group if you are familiar with contemporary jazz. Each of those musicians considered masters of their instruments. Before that, we did have Brian Blade and his fellowship band doing something from an album called Body and Shadow, released in 2017. The song that you heard was called Duality. We are here until the top of the hour doing this program live today. A radio note before we get into the next set. Next week's Crosswinds will be a repeat program. I will be out of state all next weekend. Not able to do my radio for the House of Prague. We'll run a repeat episode of this program next Sunday and a repeat episode of the Monday program on Monday. But before we get there, some more music to play for you live. This is Antonio Sanchez and Migration. It's from a 2019 album entitled Lines in Sand. This one's called Home.
star 'neath rising seas. From this place I don't believe. Hold my whole sweet relief. From here I say I can't breathe. Both fear and hurt. Can we please? Unsafe, unsounded, it's all unclear to me. Don't know how to be. From this place I must proceed. Trust in love, truth be Here I'll stand ready until hearts are truly free. Until hearts are truly free. I'll stand with thee until hearts are truly free. Until hearts are truly free.
We did 2 songs in that set. If you listen to the lyrics, a little bit of a message with both of those songs. We wrapped it up with something from Pat Metheny from a 2020 album entitled From This Place. That was the title track. Michelle DiNicello on the vocals, and I'm sure I butchered her name, but really cool vocals. Before that, Antonio Sanchez and his band Migration from 2019, album called Lines in Sand. The song that you heard was called Home. You're listening to Crosswinds. kind of combining the genres and styles of classical and jazz on that piece. Swiss composer by the name of Nick Bartsch from a 2024 album of his called Spin. That's a piece called Module 66. He doesn't title his pieces. He calls them modules. Real strong jazz feel in that one, especially in some of his piano on that piece. Real interesting musician. If you have not yet checked him out, please do so. Again, he kind of bridges classical and jazz and kind of mixes the two together. Real cool stuff. You're listening to Crosswinds. Thank you so much for tuning in. Going to close out with something from Lyle Mays, but before we get there, I've got one last set of music to play for you. This particular set of music starts with a band out of Manchester, England. Piano, bass, drums, a little bit of electronics. The band is known as Go Go Penguin. This is something from an album called Man-Made Object, released in 2016, and the song is called Quiet Mind. The last set for this episode of Crosswinds goes to Japan. A three-piece group known as Mouse on the Keys from their 2018 album entitled Tres. The song that you heard was called Dark Lights. And then before that, from Manchester, England, another three-piece band. Go-Go Penguin, 2016 album entitled Man-Made Object. The song that you heard was called Quiet Mind. Before we leave you with something from Lyle Mays, I want to remind everybody that we do this every Sunday, live, here at the House of Prague, www.houseofprague.com. 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. every Sunday. We will be back next week, although in repeat fashion. The program next week will not be live, as I will be out of state, but we will have a repeated program for you next week, 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. So grab your friends, come on in. It's going to be great jazz to put that groove in your Sunday step. We'll be back live on this program in 2 weeks. I'm going to leave you with something from Lyle Mays. He won a Grammy Award for this particular track. Best Instrumental Composition. This is a piece that was released after he died. His family and friends helped put the finishing touches on this piece that he had been working on. Lyle Mays, if you don't know, a piano player, composer, keyboard player, best known for his work with Pat Metheny and the Pat Metheny Group. Did very few solo albums on his own. He did about half dozen solo albums, going all the way back to 1978. And as I said, this piece was released after he'd passed. It's a longer piece. It's about 15 minutes long. We're going to leave it with you. It is something called Eberhard. And until we meet again, may all of you be well, be blessed, and know that you are loved. You've been in Crosswinds. I am the Mercurial Stranger.